All right, so now that we've talked about the 4 biases that impact experimenters, now we are going to be talking about a few more different biases and errors that will impact research subjects. And once again, this is pretty specific to Psych and Soc, so you're definitely going to want to add these to your flashcard deck. The first type of bias we are going to talk about is a self-serving bias, which is also known as the attribution error. And this is the tendency to attribute negative actions or behaviors to external events or situations, and positive events or positive behaviors to internal factors like disposition and personality. So this is something that we actually all do once again. I know I was really thrilled when I was reading through all the Psych and Soc things because I had no idea that these biases and errors existed, but a lot of them do, and you should be able to think of many examples from your personal life if you do a little reflection, and this will also help increase how well you remember these terms. But anyway, that was a little tangent. But anyway, let's talk about the self-serving bias or the attribution error. So negative behaviors and actions are attributed to the environment, while positive behaviors and actions are attributed to yourself or your internal, personality, disposition, cheeriness. So what does this look like in terms of a situation you might see? So let's say your question on the MCAT asks you, there was a teenager, or let's say that there's experimenters or researchers that are studying aggression in school-aged children. So let's say that they one day see a child start a fight on a playground, and they ask the child, why did you start that fight? The question might ask you what, according to the self-serving bias or the attribution error, what would, the child attribute this fight or this negative action. So the first thing you want to do, which I just did, is figure out what type of action it is. Is it positive or negative? So in this case, starting a fight is a pretty negative action. It can be very violent, it can be very destructive, so it's a negative action. And according to the self-serving bias and the attribution error, we know that negative actions are typically attributed to the environment. Whether that's correct or incorrect, doesn't matter. That's what people like to attribute these negative things to. So if there's an answer choice that says something like, oh, it was really hot outside and I felt aggressive because of the heat, right? That's blaming that fight on the heat, or it's placing the blame for that outside the body. Similarly, oh, those kids pushed me, right? That's blaming it on the situation, not on yourself. And those could be true once again, but it could also be, the kid is just aggressive or something like that. But remember, negative events and behaviors are attributed to the environment, external factors, while positive behaviors and events are attributed to internal disposition, personality, and thoughts. So that's the attribution and self-serving bias. I've seen that come up personally on MCAT questions several times. So you're really going to want to pay attention to that, map it out if you need, but make sure you go through some examples in your own life as well. The next type of bias we are going to talk about is the social desirability or response bias. And this simply is the tendency of research participants to answer questions in a favorable light along with social cues. So this is essentially let's say you're being interviewed, right? You want to please your interviewer, even if you're not going to get a job from it, even if it's a strictly informational interviewer. We crave to please people that we're with. And in a study, right? Let's say you have a teenager who's talking to an older researcher, or let's say it's a teenager with their entire family talking to a researcher, and the researcher asks the teenager, tell me about, your sexual habits, right? In that case, the social desirability bias or the response bias is at its height. The teenager's gonna wanna give an answer that pleases the older researcher and one that pleases their family. So they might say, oh, I abstain from sex, I don't have sex at all. And whether or not that's true, that's them showing and trying to please the researcher and their group setting by giving a socially favorable answer based on the social clues that are given. So this is something that's really important. Anytime that you see a type of group research mentioned, you're always going to want to be thinking about the social desirability bias, because nobody wants to let other people down or to be the odd duck out in a research group. So you're really going to want to keep an eye on this just in case. And that's the social desirability or the response bias, which is the tendency of participants to answer a question as they perceive the researcher wants to hear based on social cues that they pick up. Next, we are going to be talking about hindsight bias, and this is actually a pretty common term. for people to use. But hindsight bias is essentially the feeling of, oh, I knew that was going to happen, even though you didn't know it was going to happen. And there's a saying where it's hindsight is 20/20, and that's very true. So one example, I guess, of this bias is after a tragedy, a lot of people might say something like, oh, I had a really bad feeling that something was going to occur, or something didn't feel right. And in the moment, it probably felt fine and everything, but instead, hindsight bias makes us want to know things happened before they did. So anytime you catch yourself going like, oh, I knew that was going to happen, even though you had no idea, that's hindsight bias. So you're going to want to watch out for that in terms of research studies. When people say, oh, I knew that was going to happen, even if there's no way they did, that is simply us trying to take credit for that and cope with the fact, in this case, the tragedy, right? And try to make it a little bit more, work through that. The next bias that we're going to be talking about is the misinformation effect. And this is the tendency of participants to recollect something wrong due to information they received after the fact. So we're going to continue with the tragedy example here. Let's say that there is a big tragedy that occurs, right? Something that's talked about relentlessly on the news, and it's talked about in social circles, and it's talked about in newspapers and articles. Right? If you ask somebody what happened, let's say the day after 9/11, they might say it was, it was a cold day and I was on my way to the office and I heard something on the news, right? But if you ask them 5 to 10 years later, they're going to start inserting information unconsciously based on things that they might have heard or other people said or they heard in the news. So they might, all of a sudden their story might be, it was a cold day and I was walking to work and that was when I heard the sirens, right? But in reality, they might have been someplace else. Maybe they were not in New York City on that day and they weren't actually there. So it's not malicious at all. It's simply you've heard things, you've seen things after the fact, and you start to integrate those into your own experience and it feels very real. It's just a matter of incorrectly remembering. So this is also, you'll find this term in memory as well. So this is really just when you get information after the event that interferes with an accurate representation or collection of what happened on that day that you are being asked about. And then the last bias we are going to talk about is the Hawthorne effect. And this is the tendency of people to change their behavior if they know they are being watched. So what I mean here, right, is if you put two best friends, let's say you put two best friends in a room and you're like, hey, build a tower together or something, and you walk out. If they're not being watched, they're probably going to be having fun and laughing, and maybe they'll be silly and throwing blocks at each other or something like that. But if they know they're being watched, aka you say build a tower, and then you go sit behind a desk and look at them, because they know they're being watched, they're going to act differently. And I guarantee you that they're going to act more civilly, they're going to be much more reserved and mature and act a little bit more professionally, or maybe they're really going to prioritize speed because they know they're being watched. So this is something that really happens with every type of experiment that includes observational studies. So if you're ever asked for an observational experiment, what might have impacted the participants' behavior, the Hawthorne effect is never a bad idea, because if people know they're being watched, they are going to alter their behaviors. So just to recap, in terms of in terms of biases and errors impacting participants in research studies, we have the attribution error, or the self-serving bias, which is I attribute negative things to the environment, positive things to internal factors. We have the social desirability or response bias, where participants will answer questions how they think the researcher wants to hear to please them. We have hindsight bias, which is the, oh, I knew that was going to happen feeling, even if you didn't. We also have the misinformation effect, which is the tendency of participants to recollect events inaccurately by integrating in information they've learned since. And then lastly, we have the Hawthorne effect, which says that if people know they're being watched, they are going to change their behavior. So I hope this video has been helpful in going through a whole bunch of different types of biases and errors impacting researchers and also participants. Once again, most of these are not malicious. A lot of them are done unconsciously, and that's why we have these peer-reviewed journals. That way other researchers can look through studies and see these blind spots, right, that other researchers might have missed, and see any factors that might be mediating, modulating, confounding in this study. And simply being aware of these biases and errors when you're reading through the MCAT passages is really helpful because you'll be able to identify them as you go along. And if you're asked a question specifically about them, you'll have an idea of what the definition is, but then also the examples that I gave you today. So I strongly encourage, simply because there are so many biases, I think we talked about, 9 of them today. There's so many biases, and then you throw in groups and variables and experimental design. There's so much going on with this, so make flashcards out of these different biases and errors. Try to include an example of them, or try to include a definition if you want to shake it up. But make sure that you're going through these on a regular basis. That way they don't stack up and accumulate, and all of a sudden you have to memorize 9 in one day. If you can space these out or get some type of spaced repetition in there, this will make it a lot easier to remember these long term and understand the nuances and differences between them.